Welcome to beautiful downtown Burlington on this beautiful Thursday evening here in late fall in Vermont. Today at Phoenix Books in Burlington, Vermont, we're hosting Jeffrey Beerworth. He's written this fabulous book called Historic Crimes and Justice in Burlington, Vermont. I just learned a few minutes ago, actually, that Jeffrey is a native Vermonter and has been on the force for about 8 years. This book took him about 3 years to write. And I was reading through it the other day and realizing that I think we actually live in a time where the police department is so professional that we take it for granted. Because you read through this book and there were times when the police department was at odds with the mayor and it was really political and there were, it was kind of horrible, I think. And to have such a great police department now, I think we're really blessed. And the fact that we sort of take it for granted just tells me that they do a great job. And I wanted to thank Jeffrey personally for being part of that. And here he is to talk about his great book. Thank you so much.
I've been with the department for about 8 years. And for the last 3 years, I've been doing research and writing this book. And it's been a pretty fun project. And I'll just kind of basically start by giving an overview of what it was like in Burlington in the early years of the city and what it was like to be a police officer. And I might touch upon some of the early criminal cases that were of most interest, and then we can open it up for questions and see what people have to say. Todd, I'm going to rely on you to click through. One of the great things about this project was the great photographs that I was able to come up with. We have a number of really great historical resources here locally. Uvm Special Collections, the Fletcher Free Library has a wealth of opportunities for historians, and this was really a gem. This is City Hall Park in 1859, so it can give you an idea of what the city looked like back then. Very different than it is now, but this is where it all started. The city really was first incorporated in 1865. That's when the town of Burlington really organized itself into an incorporated city. And it started by organizing the various departments of the town into organized sections. And they did that via the city charter. As far as the police department was concerned, really the first major step was to create a first constable, which is now known as the chief of police. But this office was basically created to supervise and run the officers of the department. The first constable, if you will, was Luman Drew. He was a very prominent businessman in the city. He owned a meat market here in Burlington. He was also the county sheriff, which was an office that was commonly shared in those early years with the chief of police. Really what made him most, really the first pick for the job was he had served honorably in the St Albans Raid. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. It was really the northernmost action of the Civil War, where Confederate rebels robbed banks in St Albans and tried to burn down the city. Luman Drew, who was serving as sheriff at the time, was also attached to the army and carried dispatches and orders to pursue the rebels into Canada. So his service was deemed to be one of merit, and he was made chief of police in 1865. I kind of covered that one. So basically, officers, when in those first years, had a variety of tasks laid out for them by the city charter. They were tasked with preserving law and order and enforcing the city ordinances. That also included lighting the gas street lamps when the sun went down and extinguishing them at a reasonable hour. And also removing the trash found in the streets. So whenever officers complain around the station, I like to remind them that we're at least not picking up garbage anymore. And really, Burlington at the time was a wilderness town. It was pretty unruly. There were, drunken brawls, highway robbery was a common crime. There were murders in those early years, horse theft and prostitution, and liquor-related offenses had a long history here in Burlington.
Really?
Yes, we're still dealing with that. But really, it was really given up to a local option, so prohibition kind of rotated years. There would be one year where they would vote it out and say, no, it's illegal. Then the next year they would say, no, it's legal. So there was really kind of a divided view of it in those early years. And if you can do one more. This is a really good example of what a great resource the Uvm Special Collections are. So this was in a bin that had never been opened. And I went up there doing research and I called it out and they said, no one's been through this bin to see what's in it. And I actually found this reward poster buried in there. And it's for a stolen horse and saddle and blanket out of New Hampshire. But the marshal there sent it to Burlington thinking that the suspect may have brought it there. At the time, officers, they basically were given their appointments by the mayor for a one-year term. And they did not receive regular pay for their services, which is very different now. And in fact, you can see kind of how the public sentiment was very trusting in law enforcement because they were actually paid by the arrest that led to a conviction. And the amount of money that they would be paid would be based on the fine that was levied against the offender. So very different system now. They were also given the authority to break windows, to pursue criminal offenders. And if someone could not be taken into custody to be questioned, they were given the authority to use lethal force in those cases. This was also at a time when police officers were not given issued equipment, they were not given any training, and they didn't have any procedures or rules of conduct. So these officers were really on their own trying to figure out how to maintain law and order. Really the only symbol that separated them from any other citizen in Burlington was the sheriff-style badge that they had. And we were able to find one that we think is close to the original, but this is what we were able to find. This was at a flea market, I believe. And I was able to find documents that verified that style was used in those early years. This is another picture. I believe this is from 1860. This is looking south on Church Street, and it kind of gives you that other perspective of the city. One of the really important things I think that I try and lay out in the book is that during these early years, the police force was really made up of officers from a wide variety of backgrounds. For many, it was their only means of upward mobility in society. They were working second and third jobs, trying to make ends meet. And it was really a mix. I mean, we had some officers who would work on steamships in the off season and then work as a police officer in the winter months. We also had officers who were more prominent business owners and were just involved in the community. But it was very interesting to see how political things were in those early years. A lot of early mayors would try and influence basically the populace by using the police department. They would, as soon as a certain mayor would come into power, he would automatically try and oust any police officers of the opposing political party. And this was common, something that happened in New York and Boston. As much as I wasn't able to find any, concrete evidence that this was happening in Burlington, there is a fair amount of evidence that's suggestive that those kinds of things were happening. But overall, I want, part of this is to just lay out that, police officers aren't any different than anyone else. We're all human, and it takes the community as well as committed individuals on the police department to really make a city, a safe place. And I think that's what we've developed over time, and it's something we have to keep working on, but I think we're in a really good place here in Burlington. So, briefly, I'll just kind of go over some of the high points or the major crimes that happened in those early years that are of interest and are featured in the book. Really, the Griswold murder case in 1865. This was really one of the earliest murder cases that gained public attention in Chittenden County. It actually happened in Williston, but they didn't have a police force at the time that could handle it, and a Burlington police officer, who was also a U.S. Marshal, was called on to investigate. And it really is, it turned into quite a manhunt, really. He wound up chasing the suspect to New York City and back to Vermont, and the man was eventually captured and convicted and sentenced to death for the murder. Another one, Sheriff Barton, who was also serving as chief of police. He was assaulted while maintaining the prison, the county jail. 2 inmates assaulted him and escaped, and it led to one of the bigger manhunts in the early history of the department. John Larney, he's one of my favorite characters in the book. He was known as Molly Matches, and he was widely viewed as the best pickpocket in the United States. He got his nickname Molly Matches because early on in his career he dressed up as a match girl in New York City, and during one of the major celebrations of the city he went around offering matches to gentlemen to light their cigars, and while he did that he picked their wallets, and it was said he made off with like $2,000, which at the time was quite a bit of money. But he was arrested later in life in Burlington, and he was working at the train depot picking pockets. And he actually had a bank account at the Merchants Bank here in Burlington, and he was arrested by Chief Dumas, I believe in 1896, if I have that right. But he was also a notorious bank robber and escaped from jail a few times. And one time in Massachusetts he was imprisoned and he faked going blind for so long that they actually started to let him walk the yard unsupervised, and then his sight came back and he hopped the fence. And this is a picture of Molly Matches, or John Larney. So this is probably the most notorious criminal suspect who came to Burlington, Dr. Henry Holmes. He came to Burlington in 1894 and rented a house at 26 North Winooski Avenue. He was pursued through the city after detectives arrived and were investigating him in connection with an insurance fraud scam. He was later arrested in Boston, and it was later found that he committed, some say 100, some say 300 murders over the course of his lifetime. He was really the United States' first serial killer. He was more famous for his activities in Chicago during the World's Fair, but he did make a short stop in Burlington, and he was pursued by our chief of police here. And this is a picture of him. This is probably my most favorite story in the book. This is 1898, the Mad Riot. It occurred on board the Reindeer, which was a steamship on Lake Champlain. And it involved soldiers from the Vermont Regiment, and they were coming over the ship from Plattsburgh, and 2 African-American gentlemen were paid to keep order on the ship. And an altercation broke out between the soldiers and these 2 gentlemen, and it exploded into a riot on the ship. The soldiers were trying to lynch the 2 men who had assaulted one of the soldiers, and while the ship is desperately trying to cross the lake to Burlington, all this is happening. The 2 men were able to separate themselves from the soldiers and hid in various parts of the ship, but as soon as they hit the Burlington docks, everything kind of erupted again. Police officers were called, and officers with the Burlington Police Department held off the soldiers, got the 2 men off safely, and a few officers were injured during the riot. Bottles were being thrown. It really was the equivalent of a drunken brawl on a ship. The The soldiers later followed the two men to the courthouse and were threatening to basically charge the courthouse and get the two men so they could be lynched by the mob. Again, officers worked to hold them at bay, and they were able to get the two men away safely. The mayor, the situation was complicated further by the fact that there was a major political rift between the chief of police and the mayor at the time. Also, the judges in the court weren't sure which part of the lake the assault occurred on, so they weren't sure who had jurisdiction to hear the case, whether it was New York or Vermont. In the end, reasonableness prevailed, and they decided to drop the charges against the two men for the assault based on the jurisdiction piece. But I think what's most important to remember is that officers in 1898, despite how their own personal feelings may have been around race, they did risk their lives to save two men from imminent danger. So, that with all the various pieces of that story, I think it's really one of the more entertaining stories in the book. I think this was the first officer, first Burlington officer to be killed in the line of duty, James McGrath. He was killed in 1904. He was trying to take a deserter into custody and was shot 4 times in the chest. He died right in the middle of Main Street, right above where the lumber yards were at the time. He was given last rites actually in the middle of the street and then taken home where he died. But there have been 3 officers that have died in the line of duty. Really, there is a 4th that I think should be added to the memorial wall, and his application is pending. But James McGrath was the first to give his life in the line of duty. This is an early photograph from the department in 1913. This really has a lot of interesting characters in the photo, that's why I include it. The first is in the center there, Mayor James Burke, who was a very popular mayor at the time. He was really one of the first, if not the first, Democratic mayor of Burlington. I believe there was one mayor who was a Democrat, but he only lasted a couple years. But he was really the first mayor to come in and offer representation to city government for the immigrant populations that were coming to Burlington at the time. So he was very popular. He did a lot to improve the city. He did a lot of good things. He was also one of the longest serving mayors. For whatever reason, he wasn't afraid to get political with the police department, and he had a pretty contentious relationship over his tenure in City Hall. This is Chief Patrick Russell. He was really a popular chief in those early years. He was known for his interrogation techniques. At the time, police officers were using what was called the 3rd degree, which was being used in New York City, which is a very controversial interrogation method. The reason he was popular was he didn't refer to those methods. He just talked with people, and he seemed to be able to get confessions without using those methods. So he was very popular for that reason. His son actually would later work for the department and also become chief of police. This is Sergeant John Ryan. He was the department's first deputy chief at one point. And the reason I have him in here is that he was shot through the thigh while taking someone into custody, and very, very narrowly missed being shot in the chest. Another officer happened to tackle the gunman just at the right time, and the shot went through his leg instead of his heart. So he continued to work for the department. This is Deputy Chief Patrick Cosgrove. He would later become Chief of Police and really was one of the longest serving members of the police department. He also had a contentious history with Mayor Burke. The city also, what's interesting about Cosgrove is back in this time, you weren't eligible for retirement unless you were going to die very shortly. So he actually, after 30 years with the department, he applied for retirement and they rejected his application. So he worked for a few more years, got really sick, and they eventually said, okay, you can retire. This officer, he's the fourth officer that I was talking about who I think should be on the memorial wall. He was really, the epitome of what all officers should strive to be. He was very popular in the Old North End. Actually, different wards of the city were petitioning City Hall to try and get Officer Miles assigned to their area of the city. He was known for his strength and courage. There was a fire in the Old North End. He ran into the building to try and save a young girl who was on fire. He pulled her out of the building. She wound up dying because of the burns. He actually received debilitating burns to his arm. It burned through the tendons in his hand, and he was permanently disabled for the rest of his life. That didn't stop him, though. He kept working. I think a couple years later, while arresting a subject on an arrest warrant, he was shot in the back. The bullet lodged in his lung, and he was out for a few months, and they left the bullet in his lung, and he continued to work for another, I want to say, 10 years. And he worked with basically the equivalent of walking pneumonia because of this bullet that was lodged in his lung. And he did eventually die of pneumonia, and the doctor at the time noted the bullet as a cause of death or a contributing factor to his death. So we do have an application in for him for the memorial wall down in DC. I think he belongs on it, but they have a very strict criteria down there, so we'll see if it gets accepted. This is really kind of an iconic vehicle for the department. This is known as the Black Moriah. This was the first paddy wagon style vehicle that the department had. They got it in the mid-1920s, and at the time the Burlington Police Department was running the ambulance services for the city as well as police related issues, so it wouldn't be uncommon for intoxicated persons to be thrown in here, criminal suspects, but also any injured parties who called for medical treatment. They would be transported to the hospital in this vehicle. That's probably, I think we can probably stop there and open it up for questions. And yeah, we've got a couple. Go ahead.
I have a question about you said initially they weren't outfitted with any sort of protective gear or anything at all. I'm kind of curious when did bulletproof or bullet protective vests become a thing, and
Sure.
What kind of equipment were the officers who were shot on the line of duty wearing at the time?
Bulletproof vests were a ways off. The Chief Russell, who you saw in that photo, he was very popular, and he actually won a popularity contest amongst the chiefs of police in New England. And the prize was what they called a shot-proof vest. And it was really the first, it had just been invented, and he was given a single bulletproof vest. I don't know how effective it was, but he was the first to be given one. Our officers were not issued bulletproof vests until the 1980s. And so it took a while. So all the officers who died in the line of duty or who were shot were not wearing protective equipment. As far as other equipment early on, they would have had firearms, but they would have been their own firearms. They would have worn their own clothes. Merchants Bank, who's had a long relationship with the department, very early on donated money to get uniforms for the officers of the department. They could only afford so many, so officers would have to share those. As things progressed, there was a push to try and get the department uniformed. I mentioned Mayor Burke and his contentious relationship. He actually vetoed several resolutions to get winter jackets for the police officers. And finally, the city did approve, the Board of Aldermen approved uniforms for the officers, but they only agreed to pay for a portion of the uniforms, and the officers had to come up with the rest of the money. So things were tight, but that was a real thing for the officers to be dealing with. Yes, sir.
Who was the oldest living retired officer you interviewed?
Oh, so probably the oldest living officer I've interviewed was James Scott, Bucky Scott. What a character and what a great man. That was really one of my favorite aspects of this project, was really speaking with a lot of the older retired officers. And he had just, what an interesting guy, and he's lived quite a life. One of the more famous criminals who came to Burlington, who wasn't in the slide presentation, was a man by the name of Frank Sprenz. Yes, he was the flying bank robber. He was on the FBI's most wanted list at the time, and he crash landed a plane in what was the Colchester airfield, trying to escape from FBI agents. And James Scott, Bucky Scott, was one of the Burlington officers who pursued him once he landed. He was able to get away, and he escaped to Mexico, where he was later arrested, and he spent most of the rest of his life in Alcatraz. Yeah.
You know anything about the more modern crimes, like in the 70s? I mean, I was wondering if you knew about these two kids that got in trouble. I think they went into a park on the south side. They came from the old North End.
Would it have been late 70s?
Yeah, you know about there were two kids. There was a whole book about it.
You know, it could be what I'm guessing. Were they shot by police, or?
No, they were put in jail, but they were tried as adults, I believe. It was a precedent-setting case.
You know, there were a couple incidents that might fit that. One was a late 70s shooting, police shooting. It was the Brewers motor shooting, where two teenage, while they were about 20 years old, they had broken into the Brewers Motors building, which is actually the current police station. And detectives at the time had gotten a tip that they were going to be committing the burglary, and a shooting resulted in that. And it was a very controversial shooting at the time. Pat Leahy was actually the state's attorney. And it was deemed to be justifiable, but one of those subjects died as a result of the gunshot wounds. So that I don't know if that's it. The only other one I can think of would be the Rudolph murder case, but that happened in the New North End. It was a juvenile who killed his stepsister and stepfather. Yeah.
It's another case. I wish I could remember some of the names.
I was wondering if he was talking about the two Burlington boys who killed Morgan O'Rourke and at the junction in '78 at the Maple Street Park.
Oh,
Older
could
Burlington
be.
boy, Robbie Savage, and his associates.
Oh,
That's who you're thinking of?
it could be. Yeah, I mean, really, the book, you know.
Megan's Law. They may have it upstairs.
Yeah. Oh,
They may
okay.
have it upstairs.
The book about it, the
Yeah,
whole book.
it's called Megan's Law.
Oh, okay.
Long out of print, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what's been interesting, you know, a lot of the research, unfortunately, the book, you know, through the editing process has gotten whittled down quite a bit, as manuscripts do. So there's a lot of stories that aren't in the book, but there's just a wealth of research out there that you can tap into if you're interested. So,
Thanks for doing all of it.
yeah.
There's a great photograph on page 161 of Bernie Sanders and McGriff, the crime dog.
Yes.
Should probably send that to the Daily Show.
Yeah, and that's with Chief Scully.
And Chief
He's
Scully,
still
yes.
around.
That's
So,
an awesome one.
yeah. All right. Any other questions?
The Paul Lawrence case created quite a lot of havoc in the department.
It did, and that's really, you know, one of the main things about writing this book. You know, as much as I am a part of the department, you know, I think that when we have made mistakes and when you have screwed up, it's important to acknowledge that, because so much has happened in the history that just isn't known. I think it's important for officers to know where the department's made mistakes, just like it's important for citizens to know. And Paul Lawrence was really one of those big cases. This was the late 70s. He was attached to the St Albans Police Department as a drug investigator, but he very quickly made a name for himself making these huge drug busts. And everyone just thought he was, as good as it gets. And Burlington had a drug problem at the time in the late 70s, and they asked for his assistance. So he was attached to the detective unit in Burlington. They very quickly, detectives that were working with him very quickly became suspicious of his methods. And they actually started an undercover investigation investigating him. And they discovered that he was falsifying drug busts. Basically completely falsifying affidavits and arresting innocent people on drug charges. So, I mean, hundreds of drug arrests were overturned as a result. One suspect who he had claimed to sell drugs to, or to have bought drugs from, was actually in jail at the time that he claimed this drug deal went down. So, he went to jail, I want to say for 7 years, but I can't say for sure. And it really, what that did, obviously, law enforcement everywhere, when one of us makes a mistake like that and conducts that kind of themselves that way, it affects us all. And that's really something that officers going forward after that incident had to live with going out on the street. And it takes a while to really rebuild that kind of trust.
A lot of cases out of court.
Yeah. And what was good that came out of that was procedures around drug investigations were tightened up. You had public oversight, judicial oversight. So it really changed the way we operated. And my favorite thing, which I think is worthy of noting, is that the officers who, it was police officers who arrested this man. And they were good officers, honest officers, and they worked to get kind of a bad apple out of the barrel. So Kevin Bradley was the main investigator on that. He later became state's attorney and was later an immigration judge in Florida. The other officer who worked very closely on that was DeMag, who is now our U.S. Marshal in Vermont. So, I mean, it's important for law enforcement officers and the public to be vigilant and to really watch out so so people with these ideas don't infiltrate the police department.
That case was destined to happen because it ended up in the safe of the mag with the chief of police in St Albans.
Yes, you're right. Yep. Yes, go ahead.
Did you come across anything about early relationships with journalists?
Oh, that's a good question. No, not specifically. The Burlington Free Press at the time was actually a very conservative Republican newspaper. So, going through the research, you kind of have to wade through the political side of things and say, okay, they're telling me this is what this information's telling me. There wasn't really anything specific about reporters and the police. One thing that was of interest was later on in the 70s, there was a Free Press reporter, photographer for the paper, who at the time, we didn't have the best camera equipment, and he would actually get called on to do our crime scene photos. So, I mean, very different than, we're not going to be calling the Free Press to do our crime scene photos now. Yeah. But that was something where I think, that relationship has changed over time. And I think, more modernly, with technology, we're going to see that changing even more because, you can't have a relationship now where police officers just say, no, we're not going to tell you anything. Because people are on scene with cell phones finding out what's going on anyway. So, hopefully we see that change and there's a little bit more communication and, when necessary anyway. So, any other questions? Why did I write the book?
What gave you the motivation at this point in your career to write?
Sure. Well, really, this was more of a personal interest than anything. I've always loved history, always had a strong interest in history, and, obviously, I became a police officer, and I loved my job. So really, the two combined to create a perfect storm for this kind of project. With that said, I kept it all separate. I did this all on my own time, and as much as I was a part of the department, I thought it was really important to find out what the history was so we know kind of what got us to this point and how we can move forward from there. And it was great. I mean, I really enjoyed working on it.
It would have been really rewarding had you been 20 years ago where you could have talked with people like Wayne Liberty and
Yes.
the Bouvier brothers and
Yeah.
some of those people that had some different times with the motorcycle contingencies that on their spare time they worked for the undertakers.
Yes.
Second job.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I love so much about the interviews I've done. It's about talking with people who have.
History is.
Yes, and really, it's just regular people who have chosen to dedicate themselves to this line of work that really is demanding and so important to do. And they're around. I mean, you can find them. They're still living in the city and going to all the grocery stores and shops like anybody else. And boy, if you can find any of them, really tap into that because they've got some stories and some great history there. Any other questions? I think we're good. Thank you. Thanks for coming out, everybody.